Hi everyone, today's video is going to be an introduction to the law of tort, looking at the rules and theory of the law of tort. So what I'd like you to think about, you may know a lot about this, you may know nothing at all, that's no problem at all, but I'd like you to think about the two following questions before we move on. So this is just from what you already know, no pressure. I'd like you to think about, well, what is the difference between civil and criminal law? And I'd also like you to think about the difference between public and private law. So what we're going to be having a look at today is civil law. So we are looking at primarily individuals up against another individual. Now, when I say individual in this context, it might be a business, but we're not talking about the state here. And this is what makes it private law. So this isn't to do with the state, such as criminal law, where the state is saying that certain conduct is against the rules and we condemn that. We're looking at private individuals or private companies who are going up against other private individuals. So let's first of all look at the overall concept of the law of tort. So this is the part of civil law. And the word tort comes from the French word for wrong. So there you go. You've learnt some modern foreign languages in law. And the law allows people to claim compensation when they've been injured or their property has been damaged. And for first year law, for AS, we look at the law of tort, of the tort of negligence. So let's have a look at that concept of negligence. This can apply to a wide range of situations, and it's going to be situations that you find yourself in. So it might be when you're on the road, if you're having to undertake some sort of medical procedure. And we're looking at situations where a person may be injured or their property is damaged because of the negligence of another person. And negligence is the breach of a legal duty to take care resulting in the damage to the claimant which has not been desired by the defendant. We'll look at damage in far more detail. It can be damage to their property, it can be damage to their physical person, and it can, in some circumstances, be psychiatric damage. And this can be seen in the case of Blythe and Birmingham Waterworks. And this defines negligence as the omission to do something which a reasonable man would do, or doing something which a prudent and reasonable man would not do. So negligence requires 3 stages to be proven. The first one is duty of care. The next is breach of that duty. And thirdly, that breach of duty has to cause damage. Now, I've done a video for each one of these concepts, so don't think, oh gosh, I don't know what that means. You'll watch this video, which is your introduction, and then you can look into each of those stages in more detail. So let's have a look at the remedies. So if you successfully sue somebody in the tort of negligence, what is the remedy going to be? So if you're successful, you may be able to claim damages, which is a financial payment paid by the defendant. And the aim of this is to put the claimant back into the position they would have been in had the negligence not occurred. You may also be able to receive what's known as an injunction. This either stops a party from doing something or forces them to do something. So you may be able to ask for an injunction to stop somebody playing music after 10 o'clock at night. Alternatively, you may be able to receive an injunction which forces somebody to move their bins off your property, for example. The courts and tracts is something that we're going to come back to, but I wanted to just mention it so that it is in your mind. The case is going to start either at the county court for the lower value claims or the high court for higher value claims. and it is allocated to that particular court based on the value and the complexity of the case. The value and complexity is assessed by looking at which track is most appropriate. You have the small claims track for the lowest value, simplest cases. You have the fast track for in-between cases, if you will, and for the most complicated and most expensive cases, then the case is allocated to the multi-track. Appeals will be heard at the Court of Appeal and may go to the Supreme Court, or the first appeal may be at the Supreme Court. But as I say, we're not going to look at that in detail today. So the standard of proof. The standard of proof is how much the claimant must prove their case. And the standard of proof is on the balance of probabilities, or more likely than not. So the claimant has to prove, and it's the claimant who has to prove it because they brought the case in the first place, that their version of events is more likely than not. So the judge needs to be 51% sure that the claimant is telling the truth rather than the defendant. Now, this is a change from criminal law, which requires a much higher standard of proof. So let's look at some individual things that you need to be aware of. You don't need to know a great deal about these things, but we're thinking about the concepts which are required. So one of the key concepts that runs throughout the law of negligence is fault. What you are essentially proving is somebody is at fault and that has caused you damage, whether that's damage to your physical self, to your property, or psychiatric damage. And usually the defendant, it is required that this is proved against the defendant, that they are at fault. However, there are some things known as strict liability where there is no requirement to prove fault. It's usually because it's quicker, simpler, and easier for the claimant to prove as they don't require evidence to be produced to show how and why the accident happened. So the strict liability instances that we look at is the law of nuisance. So it's an action to stop an unreasonable use of neighbouring land. Something known as the rule of Rylance and Fletcher. This is an action for damage to land caused by material, usually water, escaping from the neighbour's land. And what is known as vicarious liability. This is where an employee does something in the course of his or her employment, and therefore his employer is what's known as vicariously liable. So employers are liable for the actions of their employees. We don't need to have a look at that in a great deal at this stage, you just need to be aware of it. We also have to have a look at balancing conflicts of interest. So when the judge is looking at a particular case, they will do their best to balance the interests of all the parties, assuming the parties' interests are on the same level. However, if you have a public interest going up against a private interest, the public interest will always prevail. So looking at morality and tort, law of morality is something that we will look at throughout the course and we will continue to come back to. This is going to be a concept we look at in a lot of detail in the second year, but just so that it's something there at the back of your mind. So morals are usually based on people's beliefs. They can have religious connotations. And what we're looking at is it morally right if the duty of care is owed and broken that compensation will be paid? Now you might automatically say, well yes, if somebody has breached their duty and somebody got hurt, then they should pay. But what if a firefighter is rescuing you from a burning building where you will surely die, and in the course of that rescue they dislocate your shoulder and they damage your shoulder? Now they owe you a duty, arguably, now there'd be evidential issues, that duty has been breached. is it right and proper that you should be able to claim compensation? Most people would argue, well, actually, no, it wouldn't. So this is where we have to balance morals of the different morals and different beliefs. We also have to look at the law in respect of justice and tort. So in a similar way to when we looked at law and morals, judges will attempt to provide justice in every case. And in the law of tort, we're looking at the person who has breached a duty, they will pay some sort of compensation to the victim. Now that seems quite straightforward, but can money ever really compensate for a serious life-changing injury or death? Now the defendant cannot set right this injury or death. They can't undo what they have done. And the only thing that they can give is money. But does this actually provide justice for what has happened? So that's a very quick introduction to some key concepts that are going to run throughout your study of tort and the theories behind the law. So what I'd like you to do now to finish off is to write a summary of the concepts discussed on the previous slides. So as I say, we will look at all of these concepts in far more detail, but you do at this stage just need to have an awareness.